Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
You're watching Adventures in Music Theory with your host, Dr. Robbins.
Hello and happy April 28th to you. Feels like a fine and dandy day to be doing some online 12-tone analysis, doesn't it? And I've got lots of stuff we can play with here, including this piece that you see displayed before you right now, the Ernst Krenek Suite for Solo Cello. 12-tone piece from the late 30s, so from the days before total serialism and things like that took hold. But written from that time when composers were trying to find ways to use tone rows to compose music. And that's certainly what Krenek's doing. And I didn't bother assigning this piece as a homework, although I certainly could have. And if you were getting the piece and you were going to start analyzing it and you knew it was a 12-tone piece, or even if you didn't and you were thinking it might be, you might decide that your first move would be to go ahead and take a little census of the notes there, which is what those red notes are showing now. We've gone through and we've just put some fixed zero integers on them. And that can be useful because for some reason it's easier to see an aggregate collection in that sometimes than it is with pitch class names. But you realize, wow, within the space of the first 12 notes of this piece, Krenek has used up all 12 pitch classes. I guess this is a 12-tone piece. I guess I should go make a matrix. I would say not so fast. You could certainly create a matrix for this. It'll create just like all the other matrices out there. You know, fill in the grid, write down all the characters for the inversions and the retrograde inversions and the transpositions. You'll find yourself doing a lot of work you don't need to be doing if you do that, because if you notice what Krenek does after that first row that starts out D, G flat, F, D flat, C, once he's done with that at the end of the first line, he starts another row form that goes D, G flat, F, D flat, C. And you realize it's the exact same row form. So he does the same row 2 times in a row. Big deal. Well, the thing about this piece is that's the only row he does. If you follow it all the way through, you'll see that every single time all he's doing is going through that initial row, that row that we could call P2 if we were going in fixed zero integers. The whole piece is that row form. I haven't gone through and marked them all, but I've marked enough of them to where you can see that he seems to be really using that row form and only that row form for most of his construction here. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't let that 12-note row dictate the lengths of his phrases. or anything like that. You'll notice that his phrases tend to overrun the notes, and sometimes he'll be in the middle of this row when he starts another musical phrase or introduces a new gesture or something like that. But he's only using one row form, and he's only using it in one direction. He's just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 over and over and over again. This is what they call cyclic rotation sometimes, which is just getting one row form and cycling through it endlessly. And that's sort of something we haven't encountered before, but we're seeing it in this Krennic piece, which, other than that, is just another piece that uses a 12-tone row. Here's a later piece from, I think, 1954. This is one of the Stravinsky serial compositions. And I thought it would be good to look at one of his pieces. We've talked a little bit about how Stravinsky used serial music when he came to it later in his career in the 1950s. But we haven't actually looked at much of his music, and I want to at least briefly fly in and look at this little piece here. This is a good piece for analysis because if you'll notice, Stravinsky and his publisher have decided that in addition to being told what notes to play, the thing our trombone players and our string players need to be told in this piece is what row form is actually going on. I don't know if those are printed in the instrumental parts as well, but this score, which is the thing that you would use if you were the conductor or something, has the row analysis done on it as well. You can see that Stravinsky's got things bracketed out. He uses slightly different terminology, but if you look on there, you'll see. So it might be good to look at what Stravinsky's little mini 5-note row is like and how things work out here. So his row, that initial theme statement he has up there is E and E flat, and then C and C sharp and D. That's his row. It's really more like what we'd think of as a pitch class set. That'd be like what, a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But it's also the row he's using. And of course, one thing about using a smaller row form like that is you don't use up all of your pitch classes. And if you look, you'll also notice that Stravinsky dovetails his row because he's got that row that starts out in the second trombone there that he labels theme, that repeats the E's and then goes E flat, C, C sharp, D. And then the next row form he's got is what he's calling an inversion. And the D that's at the end of that theme as the last note is also the first note of his inversion row that starts and goes D, E flat, G flat, F, E, which would be I2 if we're doing fixed zero integers, which seem to be the thing I like to do these days. So he's using elision or dovetailing with his rows there. The last pitch of his theme row is also the first pitch of his inversion row. But he's used a couple different row forms there. He's used the P form row form, the I2 row form. If we look down at what else is going on in the fourth trombone, we'd see that it's doing an imitation of the same row that the second trombone did. So that's another P4 row form down there. If we look at that retrograde or that reversion row, the one that starts out on B flat and then goes to A and A flat and then to C flat and C, that's the retrograde of the prime row that would start on C, so that's R0. And then he's got another theme row in the first trombone when it enters on B flat, so we might call that P10. And then finally, that retrograde inversion row that starts off, it'd be neat to just figure out what's going on with that. If you go D flat and D, then the notes we're not seeing that'll happen on the other page would be E flat, C, and B natural. So that would be RI11. Stravinsky's row, as I said, is small. It only spans a major third. It only has 5 pitches in it. What's interesting to notice is what Stravinsky's done, though, and the reason why I listed out all the pitch classes in these rows at the top is by choosing the small row forms he did, you'll notice that by the time he gets to the end of this first page, Stravinsky's already produced a pitch aggregate. Every single pitch class has been represented. He's gotten all 12 tones done, even though not all 12 tones are in any single row form, since there are only 5 pitches. He's chosen row forms that make it so that he creates an aggregate of all 12 pitches on the first page there. So we're already hearing this like we hear a lot of 12-tone pieces, with all 12 pitch classes being represented, but no pitch class really asserting itself as the prominent one or the tonal center. But really, we should probably move on to the main course today, which is that Schoenberg piano piece that I asked you to look on last Thursday. So hopefully you've gotten some time to do some analysis of this work. And maybe you've found some things that are interesting. You know, for me, one thing that's interesting about this piece is how many times Stravinsky manages to create chords that have perfect intervals in them, either perfect fourths or perfect fifths or both. He has a fair amount of chords out there that have 2/4 or 2/5 in them, and that becomes sort of one of the sounds that we hear in this piece, is the sound of that set. That, what would it be? I guess an 027 set or whatever. So, you know, Schoenberg does a good job of constructing his 12-tone piece in such a way that it allows him to write sonorities that have perfect intervals, which have a little bit of a more consonant sound to them than imperfect intervals like major and minor thirds. And of course, fourths and fifths that are perfect are also more consonant sounding than tritones and sevenths and seconds and things like that. But let's look at how he actually gets his row, because one thing we need if we're going to analyze these 12-tone pieces is it's useful to have a sense of what the row is and a matrix. And I told you all that those opening 2 measures are like not much help to us with that, because everything's stacked up. So with 4 notes happening at once, it's hard to know which is first, which is second, which is third, and which is fourth. They're just all glommed together. So I suggested that we go down to the 3rd measure, where he starts working with more melodic gestures, and see what happens there. And this is what happens there. If you go through and you use some fixed 0 integers, then you can see that in those 3 measures where he starts writing more melodically, you can see that with that upstem part, he manages to get all 12 pitch classes to come out as his melodic line. And he's got it grouped in 3 groups of 4, which might be a good way to let us know that one thing that's on Stravinsky's mind in this piece is tetrachords, grouping things in 4s. You can see that in those melodic gestures that are all 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can also see it in the very first 2 measures, where he's got that succession of chords. Each chord is a tetrachord having 4 pitches in it. So when you build your matrix, it'll look like this. And in this matrix, I've gone ahead and I've put red letters across the top to show that first row form that Stravinsky used. The one that in fixed 0 land we would call P9, or T9 if you prefer saying T instead of P. But that's our first row form right there. The first thing Schoenberg chooses to state melodically. And we're going to see that this is an important row form in the piece. So now let's start looking at some of the more headache-inducing things Stravinsky does. He's got that melodic line starting in measure 3, and I've gone ahead and labeled it P9 on the score. Now let's look at that little 2-measure introductory flourish that he does with the chords and try to figure out what's going on there. We'll do it sort of like we did in the Dalla Piccola piece we looked at earlier. What we'll do is maybe circle out each chord and just figure out, you know, where can I find those notes clumped together in the matrix. And I'm going to go ahead and put their integer numbers with them as well. So that first little chord in blue contains B and C and F and B flat, or 11, 0, 5, 10 if you want to think of it that way. So if I go looking in my matrix, I can look for places where 11, 10, 5, and 0 happen in succession in a row form. And I see it on the bottom there in that column. And I also see it in the middle of the matrix at the end of one of the rows. Both of those have a tetrachord that has 11, 10, 5, and 0 in some order. So to figure out which one is the right one, I need to look at what comes next, because depending on what comes next will help me figure out whether I want to go horizontally across with a retrograde form, or whether I want to go vertical from the bottom to the top with a retrograde inversion form. So that chord in red has A and C sharp and D sharp and F sharp in it, or 9, 1, 3, and 6. And if I look at what comes next in those two row forms, I realize the one that groups those four pitches together is the retrograde inversion form. It has 9 and 1 and 3 and 6. The other one didn't have a 3 and a 6. It had a 4 and a 7. That's not really what we want. So it looks like maybe we're using that retrograde inversion form, but to be sure, let's look at that green tetrachord that's 8, 2, 4, 7, and I see that that retrograde inversion row ends 7, 8, 2, 4. So it looks as if the row form that Schoenberg is writing for the first measure's chords is based on row form Ri4. And let's go on and see what happens in the second measure. So looking at our second measure, we'll do the same drill. We'll just throw circles around our tetrachords. We'll label their integers, and we'll figure out where to go from there. So I'll look for clumps of those integers. Like on the matrix, I'll look for, are there any row forms that put 6, 9, 11, and 5 together at their beginnings? And I can see some. I can see the one happening right there at the very, very top left corner of the matrix. I can also see those four pitches being clumped together down in the middle of a row form a little bit later there, but that perhaps is not the most useful place to look. Or even I can see it happening in that column that just showed up in blue there. But yeah, 6, 9, 11, 5 seems to happen most promisingly in the upper left-hand corner. In fact, unless that last lasso I put in, we have to ignore that there's a 0 that has managed to wheedle its way in there. So let's look at what the little red tetrachord says. It says we should have G and B flat and C and E, or 7, 0, 10, and 4. And the second tetrachord in my top row is 10, 0, 7, 4. And the last tetrachord has 3, 8, 1, and 2, in order of 2, 1, 8, 3 here. So the form of the row that Schoenberg, who I know I keep calling Stravinsky because it's more fun to say, but it's Schoenberg, the form of the row that Schoenberg is writing in measure 2 as chords is P9. Interestingly enough, that's also the form of the row that Schoenberg is going to use as his first melodic statement in measure 3. So that row across the top of the matrix is something that's exerted itself twice in the piece. We'll look and see if it has more to say later on in the piece as well. But already we see sort of a favorite row form emerging here. And if we want to move on down to that melodic phrase that happens in measures 3, 4, and 5, we know what's going on in primarily the right hand with the melodic line. That's P9. But there is the left hand accompanimental materials that we might want to figure out as well. And they're presented in a combination of harmonic intervals and successive pitches. So we're going to have to do a little bit of unscrambling there as well. But when we go to look at what's going on, I see that the collection of notes in the left hand in measure 3 is E and D and A flat and G, which is 4, 2, 8, 7. And if we go looking, we'll find that there are tetrachords of rows that have those notes. And the second tetrachord is 3 and 1 and 6 and 9. And then the final tetrachord of that row, the notes we're missing are C and B, or 0 and 11, and F and B flat, which are 5 and 10. And they actually happen, they're sort of spread out. The 0 and the 11 happen at the end of measure 4 going to measure 5, and then the 5 and 10 happen, they're in the right hand as the very last two things we hear in measure 5. So if we want to figure out what that row form is, it's the row form I4 that goes from the bottom, or from the top to the bottom of the matrix there. So, and didn't he use RI4 as his first measure's chords? So he's got one vertical row and one horizontal row that he's used thus far. Forging farther ahead, we can try to figure out what's going on in these next measures now. And it's another one of those places where we're confronted with some simultaneities or some chords, and we're confronted with some places where there are successions, pitches after one another. So the very first simultaneity I hear is C, F, and B flat, one of those quartal chord sounds that I mentioned Schoenberg is enjoying creating here. So if we could find some collection of pitches that had 0, 5, and 10, that would be good, especially if they might also be prevailed upon to include that B natural on the bottom, which is 11. And there is 0, 5, 10, 11 happening in our matrix. In fact, we've seen that tetrachord already, and we'll see where it is in a minute. But our second collection of 4 pitches might be that A, C sharp, D sharp, F sharp collection, 9, 1, 3, 6. And then that would mean that our last tetrachord could be the E natural A, or the 4, 9, on and on and on progression. 4, 9, 8, 2. The 8, 2 being the A flat, or the G sharp, and the C sharp. So if you want to know where's that happening, these arrows are going to point out the tetrachords of the rows where you'll find that. So it's starting at the bottom going to the top. So it's a retrograde inversion row, and it's RI4 again. Remember, we've had that one. That happened as the chords in the first measure. So it's still that favored vertical row form, the I4 or RI4 vertical row form. And let's go on. Looking at all of measure 7, the first tetrachord group in it is 9, 11, 5, 6. Oh, that's promising. That's the upper left-hand corner of our matrix. The second tetrachord is B flat, C, E, G, or GE, which is 10, 0, 7, 4. And then the last tetrachord group is 2, 1, 8, 3, or D, D flat, A flat, E flat. So he's writing his top row from left to right. He's writing P9 again, which was his first melodic line in the piece, which was his chordal accompaniment in measure 2, and now it's the entirety of measure 7. It happens both as the chords, and he draws from P9 to get his melodic gestures as well. And here's what Schoenberg does after stating I9. He's got A flat and E flat in the left hand, and D flat and D natural. So what are those notes? That's like 3 and 8 and 1 and 2. And you can find the set in that horrible looking little squiggly thing I've got drawn down there. That's his set form he's writing there. And it's a retrograde form that starts at the far right side of the top row and goes all the way across to form an R9 row. So, just like he's been doing with that column that starts on 4 at the top and ends with 10 on the bottom, and he's just been going down it as an inversion form and up it as a retrograde inversion form. Now he's doing that same thing with the top row of the matrix. He's going left to right across it as a prime form, P9. And now we see that he's also going from right to left using it backwards as R9. And what is he doing in the upper hand there, in the left hand? He's doing RI4, which he's certainly shown a fondness for at other places in the piece. And it's nice to see how when a composer starts using repeated row forms, the analyzing does get easier because you sort of start looking at usual suspects. So when I'm looking at these gestures in measures 10 and 11 that are formed of mostly chords, I can sort of know that there's a good chance that they might very well be comprised of row forms I've already heard. Like that series of 3 chords in the right hand in measure 10, that's just another statement of RI4. And that series of 3 chords in the left hand in the red box, that's another statement of R9. And looking at that last measure will get us through this first page. And again, we probably don't need to look far. We can look at that series of 3 4-note chords in the right hand as being one row form, which is actually a row form that's starting in the upper left-hand corner and going all the way across to the upper right-hand corner. It's P9 again. And while that's happening, the notes in the red box are starting at the top on the number 4 there and going all the way down to the bottom. And it looks like we're dealing with another I4 row statement. So, what we're faced with here is really Schoenberg being a very motivically tight composer and limiting his row materials to just a couple of different row forms rather than going kind of wild and being arbitrary with how he uses the matrix. So if you think about what he's actually used on the matrix, since I've got it all marked in red letters there, you can see it's really not very much at all. He either goes across and left to right or right to left with the red letters on the top, or he goes up and down or down and up with the red letters sort of in the middle there. And those are the only row forms he's actually used in the opening measures of this piece. So I think that's all of the actual looking at the notes in the piece will do, but let's look at one other thing that's going on with this matrix, because it'll be useful since you all have a test coming up on Thursday. I've sort of redone the red letters now. They're not actually showing us entire row forms Schoenberg's using or anything, but I've left some of that top row in red, and I've left some of the column we were using in red, with the hope being that you'll look at what notes are red in both of those, and you realize that between that first 6 pitches in the top row, 9, 11, 5, 6, 10, 0, and then the first 6 pitches in the vertical row that are red, 4, 2, 8, 7, 3, 1, you'll notice that all 12 pitch classes are used up. They form an aggregate. So this would be a good example of a matrix that demonstrates one of those big funny sounding words that I've given you all to learn. That word being combinatorial. Those two hexachords are demonstrating hexachordal combinatoriality. Specifically, they're inversionally combinatorial because we're combining a prime form with an inversion form. So they're what we deem to be I-combinatorial. And that might be something that would be good to know about on the test. You want to know what else would be good to know about on the test? So here's how the test will be. It will focus on serialism. That's not a surprise, I would imagine. And obviously one thing I'm going to ask you to do is to complete a 12-tone matrix. And I think the one I'm going to have you complete will be a pitch class matrix. So we're going to use letter names like F sharp and B natural instead of using numbers. After you've completed that matrix, and I do mean complete, I don't mean construct, what's going to happen is on the matrix, I will have filled in some of the squares, and I will have left some of the squares blank, and your job will be to write the pitch names in the blank squares. So I might give you like every other note of a row form, and you need to put the ones in the middle. It'll be possible for you to do this because I will give you the complete prime row across the top. But rather than have you write in all the other pitches underneath it, I'm going to write in some for you and have you just fill in the missing ones, which is actually good because then you don't spend all the time it takes to build a matrix from scratch. And if you mess up, you'll know you've messed up, because if you think there should be a different note in the box than the note I've got in the box, your calculation is off. So I don't like doing matrices when somebody messes up on line 4 and then they continue to mess up the matrix for the next 8 lines. That's hard to grade without taking a lot of points. So I'm going to give you a matrix to complete, pitch class matrix. Then I'm going to give you a piece of music that actually uses that matrix, and I'm going to want you to analyze it by looking at the score and telling me questions that the matrix would answer for you, like what rows being used in measures 12 through 15, things like that. I'll ask you to do that. Also using that matrix, I'm going to ask you to write specific row forms, and I'm going to have you do it using different terminologies. Like I might say write I7 using movable 0. And then I might say later on, I might say write I7 using fixed 0. And of course, if it's I7 using fixed 0, that means that the first pitch in it is going to be G, because that's what 7 is in fixed 0. So I'm going to ask you to like prove that you understand how both of those systems work. I'm going to ask some general questions about various types of rows, which is something we talked about in the first thing, where we talked about the derived rows of Anton Webern, where he would like maybe take one trichord and put it through different permutations and manage to get an entire 12-tone row by taking that trichord and putting it in retrograde or retrograde inversion or whatever. So we'll talk about derived rows, or maybe all interval rows like the Berg lyric suite row that shows up. I want you to talk about the various guys who wrote serial music and have a sense of how different composers approach it. You know, what makes Stravinsky different from Schoenberg? And they are different, even though I've been continually mixing up their names today. But you know, what's Stravinsky's approach to serialism like? What's Berg's approach to serialism like? So understand those things. And then the last thing is I'm going to give you a list of 11 terms. It could be a term like combinatoriality. It could be the name of a person like Milton Babbitt or something like that. Or it could be like definite compositions. And I'm going to want you to choose 7 of them to identify. And the identifying is going to be basically about what do they have to do with serial composition? How are they an important element of atonal music? So that's what I want you to do. And the test will be ready Thursday, and you have until midnight to get it back to me, and I'll grade it. And then next week we'll start the last new stuff we're going to do. So y'all have fun until then. Email me if you have messages. Stay healthy and happy.